Welcome to the High Impact Medicine podcast. In each episode of this series, we talk to a medical professional who is pursuing what they consider to be an impactful career alongside or learning from previous clinical practice. Today's conversation is with Hunter Lau, who is an emergency medicine resident at Strong Memorial Hospital and the group founder for Effective Altruism Medicine. We discuss some interesting points. For example, how focusing on impact can lead to unhappiness, the consequences of suboptimal incentives in the medical education, and the ways in which the typical medical student can stay resilient in working towards their long-term goals. I hope you enjoy. So let's start off you telling us a little bit about your journey from medical school to what you're doing today.
Sure. So I started medical school with a public health system-based type mindset, and that has always been my career goal. Simultaneously, I was always interested in working in the ER, and this started before medical school. I worked and scribed in one and volunteered in one as a ER. So this dichotomy was always in my mind of wanting to, on one hand, pursue a direct impact in working in the ER, and the other hand, working larger scale system-wide change. And they seemed at the time, and still do, to be at kind of opposite ends of one another, where in the ER, you're more likely to just have one-on-one interactions and not really have opportunities for larger scale system level changes, because by the time someone gets to you in the ER, often their medical condition is already determined, and their steps of how their life is going to evolve is already determined from a health perspective. And there are many upstream determinants that have already had the chance to take their effect. Things like primary care, preventative medicine have already superseded what is happening in the ER, and you don't have the largest chance to have a direct or a large impact on their life in a potentially meaningful way, though those encounters do occur. But I was really attracted to working in the ER, and this continued through medical school. I'm drawn to situations where there's high acuity in medicine. There's seemingly a lot on the line, at least emotionally, and you have to make decisions with incomplete information, constantly taking in new data and making changes to your plans and pivoting when needed. And all of this happening in a fast-paced, chaotic environment was pretty enticing, and something I've enjoyed quite a bit. But with this kind of dichotomy and desires and my understanding in mind, and my desire to also have more of a broader based impact and work on systemic changes, I went into medical school with the idea that I would pursue working in ER as well as have another hat where I would work towards a broader impact-based change. Even though at the time I didn't think about it so formally in terms of impact, I loosely thought of things in terms of making decisions on the margin, and impact was more of a ill-defined thing. I remember at the end of the first year of medical school, I was considering going to Guatemala to do a medical mission trip with the school. It seemed like a fairly attractive idea. I was interested in global health and helping those less fortunate. But when thinking about it on the margin, I also realized that there were a limited number of spots for first-year medical students, and that if I didn't go, then there would definitely be a different first-year medical student who would go instead of me. So by not going, by going, I wasn't really providing a value that otherwise wouldn't be attained. And I also thought at the time that there was a pretty significant cost burden to fly out there to go do the trip and to do all these things. And I also wondered if that was the most cost-effective way to help the people that we were trying to. So overall, I ended up not going, and I ended up doing clinical research for a summer, and it ended up probably helping my career more significantly. And so I progressed through med school with this mindset, and then ended up, like I said, choosing emergency medicine, and still interested in pursuing system-based changes and more broad impact as it can be had.
I have to play devil's advocate to that point of thinking on the margin, because it's easy to evaluate a choice straight away if you just think about the consequences of your decision right now. But you could not have predicted potentially who you met, how you might have emotionally become invested in this particular mission, what the downstream effects could have been from the random interactions that you didn't have, right? So when you make decisions, how do you factor in the spontaneity which you can't account for just by, prior to the fact, making a cost-benefit analysis?
Yeah, and you're definitely right. You can't. And if you try to make a cost-benefit analysis and think with 100% certainty that you're going to be able to arrive at 100% the correct decision with full certainty, I think you're going to be wrong. And you're right, you do have to incorporate the chance that there is some, like you said, spontaneity that could occur that will otherwise be beneficial and that otherwise could have a positive impact on your life and potentially allow you to have a larger impact in a way that you can't foresee. I think my favorite example of this is Steve Jobs. It's a pretty well-told story, but when he went to college, he took a random class on calligraphy, and that ended up having a pretty significant impact on how he thought about artistic design. And he took that into Apple, which obviously ended up having a pretty significant impact on the world. But if he hadn't taken that course, because obviously on the margin, that decision doesn't seem like you can't foresee that outcome, then perhaps things might not have played out as they did. So I do agree that you have to realize the uncertainty in what you know, and also think about things in terms of there being a chance of your worldview being changed and your worldview being altered in a way that is beneficial, in a way that is harder to quantify when thinking about it directly on the margin.
But it seems like you have identified what excites you professionally, which is probably your practice of emergency medicine. And how do you then plan to build impact into your career alongside your practice?
Yeah, and I like to consider myself fairly early on into my career, and it's something that I'm actively working on. I think forming the EA medicine group was part of that, which we could talk about more at some point, I'm sure, as well as I am interested in working in the larger field. It's kind of newer in the US, or more formally being defined, called disaster medicine, and that involves the acute response efforts, the search and rescue efforts, and the efforts of, if there's a disaster that occurs, like a hurricane or an earthquake or something like that, playing the direct clinical role in being there, which is kind of akin to, in my mind, working in an ER. But with that, there can be a significant amount of improvement for disaster resilience and preparedness initiatives, which I think has the potential for being an impactful way for one to spend their time. How this will play out, I'm not sure. I'm hoping that eventually I'll be able to work academically as an ER doc, as well as responding to disasters, but also having a significant amount of my work being involved with preparing for disasters and improving disaster resilience. And that could be advocating for stronger systems, working with policymakers on how to improve disaster resilience in communities, which I think is something that could potentially be a lot more impactful than the direct work of responding to a disaster after it happens.
That sounds great. Like you're essentially working in the ER, but on a larger scale. I wonder, how could you describe the scale of your ambition growing as you've progressed through your career? You've built competencies in medical school and now in your training. And do you sort of feel more comfortable about thinking about bigger impact as you progress further through your career? I just mentioned this because I think sometimes for people starting off really early, they don't really have many skills or many aptitudes. And the EA message is to think about solving the world's biggest problems. And it can feel a bit overwhelming because you probably don't know how to, and you probably can't straight out of university, for example.
Yeah, it's definitely tricky to try to match your goals, ambitions with some of the things you hear in the backdrop about what can be done, what it actually, in air quotes, means to like have an impact and to make a difference. The question is how my view of this has changed over time. I think it's just become more clearly defined pretty early on in medical school. I didn't really have a sense of what it meant to be impactful or to have like evidence-based lens to think about impact. And I don't think the scale necessarily changed as I went on through the process of finishing medical school, starting residency, thinking about things from impact-based lens. It just became more clearly defined and more attainable and goal-oriented and something that I felt like I could grasp more. But it's tricky and it's tough, especially for, I think, anyone to, on the one hand, hear this messaging that, there are ways to have an impact. And if, again, the messaging doesn't say this directly, but if you're not doing something that's impactful, it can be hard to mentally think about how you navigate that without criticizing yourself too much or being too discontent.
I think for high achiever or perfectionist style personalities, it can be a bit challenging. So you started EA medicine, and what has your experience with that been so far?
It's been quite positive. The motivation for starting EA medicine was towards the end of medical school where I first formally became engage with like the EA community and the 80,000 hours community. And it was the last semester of med school and the pandemic just started. So they canceled all of our rotations, canceled all of our classes. So I had a ton of free time. And I was like, finally, I have the chance to read and explore these other topics that I've been pushing off for the past 3 years. And I did a pretty deep dive into EA. And I was like, wow, this is fantastic. This is great. This kind of aligns. This just really formalized a lot of my intuitions and my thoughts. I was like, great. I wonder if there's a medical community for people who are like dedicated to thinking about these things, who are in medicine. And then I realized that there really wasn't. And at the time, there wasn't ongoing discussions about how can people in medicine and healthcare be more impactful, and how can we think about things such that we're aligning our careers in a way that has this EA impact given lens. And that wasn't there at the time. And that motivated me to, with not really much group building experience or really any, to start the group and to attract other individuals who were also interested in that. And it's great to see that over the past few years since that's happened, the groups have both grown significantly. High Impact Medicine is doing great things as well. And they're clearly, I think my intuition at the time was right, that there was a desire for people within the medical community to think about things more formally through an impact-based lens. And it's just been very rewarding and completely positive to have so many conversations with people from the pre-medical student stage all the way up to later in their clinical career or even retired, who have these similar ideals and want to use a lens of impact to try to make the world a better place.
You were actually part of a webinar hosted by Giving What We Can called Medicine and Effective Altruism. How can we do good better? Could you just take us through some of the ways that you think medicine can be high impact?
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, one of the biggest things for people in medicine is personal fit. And I think that's probably how I view most career advice that I could give for people who are trying to find something that they feel is high impact. Your personal fit is so important. Especially in the medical system, there's such a high degree of variance in individual situations, personal attributes, what education you have, and most importantly, what opportunities are available. I think that if you think about things through an impact-based lens, constantly get feedback and strive towards improvements and are open to change and rigorously evaluating what you're doing, that there are many ways that someone in medicine can be quote unquote high impact. What I have seen in the kind of the discussions that I've had, and we've kind of concluded, and there are a handful of routes that are more prescribable, and that include, working in a governmental position of some amount of influence in the United States. That could be working for the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, WHO, or the United Nations, or other international health policy work groups. And that ties in with the different levels of policy work and advocacy. The American Medical Association is an example. I think I talked about that during the webinar as well, how they were the group that advocated for seatbelt mandates to be incorporated in, and at the time seatbelts weren't required. And obviously now that saved countless number of lives. And also policy work regarding pandemic prevention. And as I alluded to earlier, policy work regarding disaster preparedness initiatives. And that's something that I'm more particularly interested in. I think research could be another big one. Most medics have an extensive biomedical knowledge of genomic and infectious disease. And if they have aptitude for statistics and programming skills, this can also become pretty productive. And this can also involve consulting for startups like Alvia, who a company many people know of that's based in Boston. They're a relatively new startup that does rapid vaccine development. Someone like Anna Franz, who was pretty big in the high impact Germany group. She works there as a consultant right now. Cause prioritization, I think grant making research, grant making in health research can be pretty impactful. Global health research, advocacy, charity entrepreneurship, something like Lucia Coltier, what she does, and specifically focusing on low middle income groups. Other things I do wonder, and I think I'm less certain about this, but potentially having social media and writing presences. Atul Gawande, who's a pretty famous author in medicine in the US, he, in a lot of people's mind, he wrote Being Mortal, which in a lot of ways kind of ignited the palliative care movement in the US at least. And he took a pretty deep dive on what it means to Or how as a society we evaluate the end of life and death, and thinking about things from a more compassionate perspective. And it's had a pretty big impact on how a lot of people practice, and could potentially be, and I believe it is, reducing a lot of suffering because of that. And then also, I think, earning to give and donating is a ever fruitful strategy, especially for medics in higher income countries like the United States. And then group building and doing more EA related type and EA adjacent group building activities.
And for your experience in medical school and maybe now in training, what is the resistance that medics have towards thinking about their career from an impact perspective?
Yeah, my intuition is that most people don't have direct resistances that they possess. It's more of systemic and system-wide resistances. So I could speak more clearly about the United States, which obviously I'm more familiar with. The medical training process really rewards people for how well they do on tests, essentially. So how well you do on board scores determines what specialties you could go into. And there's a lot of pressure to do well, to get into higher paid specialties for a number of reasons. Why? Because they're more prestigious, they make a lot more money, and that's becoming increasingly important with the increased amount of debt in the United States for medical school and medical students. And it becomes harder and harder to choose lower income specialties like pediatrics or primary care. So innately, you have all these powerful drivers in place that drive people towards certain career progressions. In that process, there's no reward or even thought process for having an impact. That's just something that doesn't come up. So I think there are a lot of systemic resistances that are there and that need to be overcome. But at this time, it's not something that's well built into the medical curriculum, just based on the rewards and incentives that are in place.
I think that's very well put. Something that does strike me, though, is that they do teach us the social determinants of health. And they even show us, through a mechanistic pathway, how the genomic imprinting in utero affects your disease risk later in life. And yet there isn't any funnel into how doctors can help. Because I think we are probably uniquely placed in time where we have access to more information and we can form these online communities of medics. Are you hopeful about the future of medical education, or?
I'm hopeful and pessimistic, usually both at the same time in general. I'm pessimistic about how things will be in the short term, but hopeful and optimistic about the long term. I think the fact that most people receive an education about social determinants of health and know of it is probably a sign that things are going in the right direction. I imagine, I don't know for sure, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that probably wasn't the case, where that was such a widespread conscious awareness that medical students would have had. So I think that's positive and something to be hopeful for. And then in regards to how things in the medical system could change over time, I think I'm less convinced that beyond that, because like you said, there's no funnel. There's no funnel for the education that people are receiving to be aligned with a career path that is inherently more impactful.
I guess to start thinking about the world's problems or trying to have a bigger impact, you kind of need to have your own needs, and then maybe your family needs, and then your future sort of positively stable in your mind.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. And I think that plays into burnout in the medical education system as well.
How do you mean?
I think that impact and burnout can often go hand in hand with what we're talking about, how individuals can feel like they want to have careers that are seemingly impactful, seemingly rewarding, and match up with their long-term goals and their aspirations. I think, in my opinion, is if you use impact as a way, consciously or unconsciously, to measure your worth or your accomplishments, I think you're going to be unhappy. To me, this is the other side of the same coin for those who are hyper-focused on money and and people who want to amass the biggest fortune they can before they die. There is no end point to it. And to me, it's a fallacy to think that only if you were, there, meaning having X amount of financial wealth or X amount of impact, this theoretical place, whatever amount that may be, only if you're there, then and only then you will be happy. I think that enterprise is pretty self-defeating the moment you begin it and the moment you pursue it. And so I think with that can come a lot of unnecessary guilt. And it can be hard to think about things from a long-term perspective, also simultaneously trying to align your own emotional state in a way that's productive and long-term lead to success. So for me, I think that involves to do so, it's finding activities that you actually enjoy and activities that actually make you happy. And then identifying those things and how you work and how you're productive, and think about how you can incorporate those things into like an impact-based lens, and knowing that whatever you do and whatever you choose to do is not going to be the most impactful thing that's humanely possible. But as long as you're aiming to have an impact, you're frequently taking feedback, and you're trying to improve and better yourself in what you're doing, I think you're going to do quite well. And so this ties into burnout for me, because I think a big part of people being burnt out, and burnt out is kind of just a euphemism for depression in the medical system, recognize that how you make yourself happy, it might be different than others. For myself, at some point, I think it was in college, where I was sleeping like 6 or 7 hours a night, trying to be more productive, to get more hours done each day. I realized that, like, man, that was not good. I was not as happy as I could be. I was not as productive. I ended up wasting more time. And at some point I realized, like, I just need to sleep 9 hours a night, which is a lot. And I sleep 9 hours a night pretty consistently, even in residency. And so things like that, just finding out how to make your monkey mind happy in a way that will allow it to be productive, and balancing all those things I think is extremely important.
Some wonderful points there. In terms of developing skills as you go through your medical education, how can you be more purposeful about developing skills that will be useful? And what kind of skills do you think medicine can uniquely let you develop?
One thing that I would recommend for people to do is have a long-term lens of how this journey is going to go. So once you finish medical school, kind of after that, what are your next steps? What are you hoping to accomplish? What are you hoping to achieve? And that could be a career of academic research. It could be a few different things, and you're not sure. And then use a lot of your long-term goals and you're striving for to feedback, inform how you make decisions about the next steps and the next things you're going to do. And so I think that's a skill in and of itself, to have the ability to think long-term and to allow that to drive your decisions. And also, while doing so, trying to be extremely flexible and knowing that what you thought was going to be productive ended up not, and so you have to change things. And I think that can also quickly, I know this is related to more of the previous question, that can also kind of tie into burnout and how you feel during medical school. The medical education process can be extremely stressful. It can be extremely anxiety provoking. There's a high rate of depression, suicidality, and that's just unfortunately how it is right now. But again, if you think about things more from a long-term perspective, it's easier to get less bogged down in some of the minutia of what's going on within the day-to-day activities. And so, if you're in medical school, you can think about, how is this X activity going to help me achieve my long-term goals? And this can be an enormous source of clarity and relief in this neurotic and chaotic and stressful education process. So an example is, like, if your goal is to become, a pediatrician and work in public health policy or whatever to some extent, and you're doing a neurosurgery clerkship, what you're doing there is probably not going to be as relevant, even though that might be a potentially high stress, toxic environment. And there can be a lot of pressure to conform to the standards that are in place and to achieve and to do well. And that could be really what occupies all of your day-to-day thoughts. But if you step back and say, hey, what this neurosurgery attending thinks about my performance and my ability to identify, the cranial nerves in the skull mid-operation and my reaction speed to knowing them, that probably doesn't matter. So I probably don't need to go home and study that and worry about that. And so that skill and being able to step back and to direct your time in a positive way and not on these time-sinking ways can be pretty beneficial as well. And so I would say that falls into the category of long-term thinking and resilient skills, which I think is probably the biggest thing that medical students can work on, because you're pretty busy and you don't have a significant amount of time to do other things. And at times I didn't feel like I had time to do extra research or extra involvement in different opportunities. So if you could think about things long-term and work on your resilience, I think that you'll be pretty well off.
The second question, how to go through medical school, not wasting more time than is necessary.
That is a very good question, because a lot of what you learn I have many issues with the medical education process, but one of them is most of what you learn obviously isn't applicable. There's no need to learn about the mitochondrial electron transport chain for the vast majority of people. And a lot of the knowledge that you acquire, because it's mostly just knowledge acquisition in medical school, isn't going to be applicable to, even if you stay within medicine, whatever you do. So it can be very tricky. And I think to this, I would say the way I went through medical school is I tried to, again, make things pretty long-term and goal-directed. I went into it knowing that I wanted to do ER in public health, and I figured out pretty early on, like, how I get into ER residency, what grades do I need to achieve, what do I need to obtain, and then I just worked towards that. And if I had to get, pass on all my rotations, but I didn't need a high pass, then that's what I would work towards. And then I would use that additional free time and that additional mental space to do other things, like read or work out or do other fun things. So I think that the way to not waste your time is to know what you're trying to achieve and know what you're trying to accomplish. You could spend the entire time in medical school learning everything rigorously and to no end. By the end of it, you're going to know a lot of things that you don't need to know, and it probably wouldn't have benefited you.
I must say, I'm a little bit guilty of this, but what I personally need to look out for is I can get very competitive when I'm in some sort of defined system. And within medicine, it's very easy to get very competitive. I don't necessarily do it for the grades. Like, I don't optimize for the multiple choice questions to get the best answers. I just really think that I've been raised thinking that no knowledge will ever go to waste. And I really like the way it expands my thinking. And I think through actually understanding things, I can reason about medicine from a more first principles basis. So, long-term strategy, I don't know how it will work out.
Yeah, I think your described experience is pretty typical for many medical students. I think it's challenging for people who have this background of, like, the typical med student we're describing, high achieving, hardworking, probably anxious disposition. In general, it's hard. It's easy for these type of people to get placed in a situation and just work towards being the best at it without necessarily thinking about the long-term gains that you're getting by doing so. And so you're going to be the best in your class. You're going to be the best in this. And it's easy for this type of person to just pursue that kind of blindly without necessarily thinking about, like, what am I trying to achieve here? Like, what am I actually doing? And so I think taking a step back, having good mentors, having conversations with a lot of different people, and some people who are very like-minded, can be very beneficial to help align your values and align your time so that you're not just blindly following. An example of that is, for me, in the US for residency programs, there's a chief resident, which is like a senior resident who does a lot of administrative tasks for the residency program and helps out a lot. And it's kind of often like a coveted role. You have to run for chief, and then you get voted, and then it has prestige with it. And I felt myself, when I was approaching my third year and the opportunity for chief came about, I felt myself, like, internally driven to do it. I was like, this seems great. I'll be the chief. It'll be an ego boost. It'll look good on my resume, my CV. It'll help me with this, that, and this. And I thought that, but I also knew that at the same time, the work that you did as a chief was not at all in line with my career goals or any of my goals whatsoever. And it was a pretty big time sink. It ends up being like 15, 20 hours a week on top of residency. And so I knew that it wasn't going to help me and it wasn't going to be beneficial to me. But at the same time, I could feel my own ego and my own drive towards doing it. And it was something that I struggled with at times. But obviously, I ended up deciding not to do it for all these reasons.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. I feel like we've really tied in a nice conversation, because in medical school, for medical students, you do have these sort of external drives that do not necessarily align your efforts towards thinking about impact or reflecting on your values or necessarily even having the long-term view. For example, we've just finished our preclinical years and we had like a presentation about the clinical years. And the first thing they said was, like, guys, like, we know the past few years have been hard and you've probably forgotten why you even applied to do medicine in the first place, because you've just been studying behind your laptops. So yeah, it can be very easy to get quite myopic. But then I guess this is the importance of communities like HighMed, where you can have people who share your values and people who question you. And I think it's also very valuable that it's a community and people who know you, because when you read things from EA, it can be quite prescriptive as to what you should do. And unfortunately, there's like no easy answers. You can't use maximizing impact as a guide for what you should do, because you're probably not going to be doing the most maximum impact thing. So the utility of even thinking about it from that perspective, as you said, similar to with maximizing money, it can actually be quite limited and bringing personal happiness or satisfaction or actually effectiveness in bringing about that impact.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very beneficial to have people who you can go to and who can be critical of your views and your suppositions and how you're thinking about things in a way that is non-judgmental, non-emotional, and it's just purely to help you. It's important to just find people who you can talk to, who are like-minded, people who have similar values and that you can talk to, and you can even just like complain about how things are going, and then who can also provide you valuable advice. And I think as long as you do that and you continue to think about things from a slightly long-term or more long-term perspective and are open to your views being changed and incorporate your personal fit, that you'll end up finding a career that hopefully will be meaningful to you.
That's just the dream we all have, isn't it? Well,
it is.
Thank you so much for your time today and for this conversation. I found it very interesting.
Yeah, of course.